May 4th, 1945. This week, oh boy, this week. So much happens this week. This by far longest episode of the war week that it's hard to write just one hook to start off with. But here's a big one for you. This week, both Hitler and Mussolini die. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Western Allies met the Soviets at the Elbe River, cutting Germany in two. The Soviets had Berlin surrounded, and the battle in the city raged. In Italy, the Allied advance broke through everywhere, and Benito Mussolini was captured. In Burma, the race for Rangoon continued, but in Okinawa, the American advances were slowed to a crawl, if even that. Now, I mentioned Hitler's death. We did an extra episode on April 30th, which mainly covered the events going on in Hitler's bunker in late April, but also before that. You can watch that either before or after this episode. It makes no real difference, for they are companion pieces. They really go together. I will mention events in the bunker in this episode. I can't leave them out. But they're covered in depth in the April 30th episode. So, maybe watch that first, though the fight for Berlin is covered in more depth here. As for Benito Mussolini, on April 28th, he and his mistress Clara Petacci are shot, along with most of the 15-man crew that's with him, those that are ministers and officials of his puppet regime. This is in the village of Giulino de Mezzegra. On the 29th, the bodies are taken to Milan and dumped on the ground in the middle of the night at Piazzale Loreto. The bodies are soon enough, though, hung up by their feet from the roof of an Esso gas station. They are then stoned by the public. This is not the big news in Italy this week, however. The big news is that the war in Italy ends. On the 28th, U.S. Fifth Army takes Brescia, Bergamo, and Alessandria. That day, German 148th Division surrenders to the Brazilian Division, the Smoking Snakes. On the 29th, all forces in Italy officially surrender and a ceasefire is declared. This is signed at Caserta. The German representatives are those from Operation Sunrise, an attempt this spring to negotiate a surrender in Italy that we covered on our Spies and Ties series. Thing is, because of that, there's no guarantee that Heinrich von Vietinghoff, German commander in Italy, will ratify the surrender. On May 1st, Yugoslavian commander Josip Tito and his troops occupy Trieste. There is a race on, in this part of Italy, between them and the Western Allies to reach Fiume, Pola, and Trieste before each other. In this, the Allies lose. Mediterranean Theater Commander Harold Alexander orders the New Zealanders to take Trieste after they take Padua April 28th. On the 1st, they meet the Yugoslavs at Monfalcone. After some back and forth, New Zealand Commander Bernard Freyberg decides to push on to Trieste. They arrive there late on the 2nd, where Tito's forces are still fighting pockets of German soldiers and Chetnik irregulars. So on the 3rd, both forces are occupying Trieste. 13,000 Chetniks surrendered to Freyberg. Well, everyone fighting with the Axis in Italy is supposed to surrender now for definite, for on May 2nd, von Vietinghoff surrenders his troops, and the war in Italy is over. There is still fighting in Central Europe all week long, though. On the 28th, elements of U.S. 7th Army take Augsburg. Other units are crossing the Elbe or advancing on Munich. On the 29th, Dachau is liberated. This is covered in depth in the War Against Humanity series, which you must also watch to understand the horrors of this war. All of the over 500 men of the German Dachau garrison are killed, some by the inmates, but mainly by the American soldiers physically sickened by the piles of rotting corpses by the crematorium and the railway. Dachau was one of the very first concentration and later death camps built, taking in prisoners already in March 1933, less than 2 months after Adolf Hitler came to power. On the 30th, the Americans enter Munich. That same day, Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower tells Soviet Chief of Staff Alexei Antonov that American troops would not advance in Austria further than around Linz. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is upset by this and telegrams American President Harry Truman that, how about in Czechoslovakia? They really should advance and take Prague and as much of the western part of the country as they can, because he thinks if they don't play a big part in liberating it, then post-war it will go the way Yugoslavia has lately. Truman responds that he leaves the actual tactical deployment of troops to his military commanders. When this communication is passed down the line, U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall tells Eisenhower that aside from there not being any strategic consideration, he doesn't want to risk American lives for purely political purposes, so he does not plan to advance on Prague. On May 2nd, Churchill tells the House of Commons that in northern Italy and southern Austria, more than 1 million German troops have laid down their arms. That day at Oberammergau, Herbert Wagner, who designs guided missiles, surrenders to the Western Allies. So too surrender Werner von Braun and General Walther Dornberger from the Peenemünde Rocket Research Staff. The three are hurried off to Paris and from there to the U.S. to continue their work. On the 3rd, a German general and Grand Admiral arrive at British 21st Army Group Commander Bernard Montgomery's headquarters. They are there to surrender 3 German armies, but ones that are currently facing the Soviets between Rostock and Berlin. Monty rejects the offer and says only armies facing the British can surrender to the British, which means those forces in the Netherlands, northwestern Germany, and Denmark. The German bigwigs go back through the lines and tell Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz the scoop. Dönitz is in charge of things just now, which I'll get to soon. At 4:30, today the 4th, they come back and surrender those forces that Monty will accept. The German armies in Denmark, the Netherlands, and northwestern Germany. Now, already back on April 18th, Churchill told Montgomery to advance towards Lübeck and not towards Berlin, and you may wonder why. He had this to say: "Our arrival at Lübeck before our Russian friends from Stettin would save a lot of argument later on. There is no reason why the Russians should occupy Denmark, which is a country to be liberated and to have its sovereignty restored. Our position at Lübeck, if we get it, would be decisive in this matter." Speaking of the Netherlands, there's something else going on there just now. Operations Manna and Chowhound. These are food drops by Allied bombers to relieve famine there. Operation Manna runs from April 29th to May 5th and drops 7,000 tons of food into the still German-occupied part of the country. This is done by RAF units, as well as Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, and Polish ones. Operation Chowhound runs from May the 1st to next week on the 8th. The U.S. Army Air Forces drop 4,000 tons of food. This was all authorized back on April 23rd, and it's done with the consent of the Germans to save a lot of Dutch people from starvation. Allied agents negotiate directly with Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart and German officers, and they agree that the incoming planes are not to be fired on as long as they stick to certain corridors. This was a different sort of flying for the bomber crews than usual. I mean, normally they drop bombs from like 6,000 meters, but these food drops are from 150 or even as low as 120 meters. One of the navigators says that Manna was originally going to be called Operation Spam, but Manna it became. And the food dropped is canned food, dried food, and chocolate. There are some issues. For example, the food is supposed to be gathered for redistribution, but some starving people eat it straight away, which results in some deaths, which can happen when severely malnourished people suddenly eat a lot of fatty food. I'm going to turn my attention now towards Berlin, which I suspect is what many of you have been waiting for me to do. A few words in general, though, about the fight for Berlin before I get into any specifics, courtesy of Earl Ziemke. Berlin did not go down, as Hitler had imagined, in a Wagnerian blaze of glory, but in a ragged wave of destruction and despair. Corpses hanging in the streets, the work of single-officer flying courts-martial that passed only death sentences, showed soldiers and civilians what they could expect of their own leadership. But that leadership was operating on residual momentum. It could no longer formulate, deliver, or enforce purposeful orders. Individuals might be hanged, whole units could hide out. The city is not actually that well defended. It's not a fortress, but it is a bombed out, huge metropolis. And no matter how amateurishly fortified or defended, it cannot be taken quickly, especially by an army that knows that this is the end of their war and would really prefer to make it home alive. Anyhow, Berlin. Soviet tanks now closed in for the kill. Chuikov's divisions hammered their way across the Landwehr Canal, attacking in countless small attack groups, swimming, rafting, or storming those bridges still accessible. The guns blazed away at the Tiergarten, raising columns of smoke and clouds of brick dust as buildings came under sustained fire, with mortars bombarding German machine gun positions which the guns could not reach. The storming of the Tiergarten then started from the southern edge. On the 28th, the Red Army takes Moabit prison near the Tiergarten and liberates 7,000 people, a whole bunch of them Allied POWs. Soon, there is fighting in the Tiergarten itself, and the sound penetrates Hitler's bunker. Hitler is still sending out orders, but fewer and fewer people are actually obeying them. Army Group Vistula Commander Gotthard Heinrizi is dismissed, partly for not carrying out a scorched earth policy in advance of the Soviets, but partly for moving force north away from Berlin. Wehrmacht Chief of Staff Wilhelm Keitel meets with Heinrizi and 3rd Panzer Army Commander Hasso von Manteuffel the afternoon of the 28th, by which time Operations Chief Alfred Jodl is already threatening Heinrizi with treason if he doesn't specifically follow orders from the bunker. Orders which make no sense in the field by now. Keitel orders the army group to hold and to counterattack southeast of Neustrelitz. Keitel gave the order to stand in the middle of a front that was disintegrating all around him. Heinrizi took 3 hours covering the 20 or so miles back to his headquarters. The roads were clogged with refugees and retreating troops. The troops, Heinrizi observed, were marching home in columns. Keitel relieves him of his command that night and orders him to turn over Army Group command to Manteuffel. Hitler will not leave the bunker and try to leave the city, and only allows the newly minted Field Marshal Ritter von Greim, who was put in charge of the Luftwaffe late last week after Hitler stripped Hermann Goering of office, to leave. This, however, is not to try to put together any sort of aerial defenses, since there aren't any left, but to arrest Heinrich Himmler, since Hitler has discovered Himmler's attempt from last week to try to negotiate a surrender to the Western Allies. Hitler is kind of stunned that it's the SS that actually has tried to betray him, and not the Army Officer Corps whom he always suspects. Hitler's private secretary, Martin Bormann, who has a couple of other offices too, sends out a message to Karl Dönitz. The foreign press reports fresh treason. The Führer expects that you will act with lightning speed and iron severity against all traitors in the North German area. Without exception, Schörner, Wenck, and others must give evidence of their loyalty through the quickest relief of the Führer. Battle Commandant of Berlin Helmut Weidling reports on the deteriorating situation in Berlin. Ammunition for only 2 more days. Supply dumps in Soviet hands. Food pretty much exhausted. He wants to break out to the west. Hitler refuses. 3rd Shock Army leads the many-pronged Soviet assault towards the Reichstag. The Reichstag building had a lure all its own, for it would be not only a symbol of Soviet victory, but also a signal to end the war, to finish the fighting. Well, there's also the fact that the commander of the unit that raises the victory banner over the Reichstag, though it was gutted by fire in 1933, will be made a hero of the Soviet Union. Ivan Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front has some issues this day. As Pavel Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army advances, there grows a danger that they will collide with Vasily Chuikov's 8th Guards Army from Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front. So Konev orders Rybalko to turn west and push into Charlottenburg, which to Rybalko's anger means cutting him off from taking the big prizes in central Berlin, even though it was his tank army that did a lot of the actual tearing apart of the city's defenses last week. As for Lelyushenko's 4th Guards Tank Army, after the fall of Potsdam at the end of last week, he's got a tank corps still fighting for Wannsee Island and a mechanized corps heading for Brandenburg. The latter runs into advance units of Walther Wenck's 12th Army, trying to reach Berlin. Lelyushenko has specific orders to prevent that from happening, while also destroying the remnants of Theodor Busse's German 9th Army near Luckenwalde. It's Soviet 5th Mechanized Corps, though, who are facing both Wenck and Busse at once. All sides are taking heavy losses. Hitler writes his last will and testament. He now officially throws Himmler and Goering out of the Nazi Party and sets up a post-Hitler German government, appointing Joseph Goebbels Chancellor and Karl Dönitz President. Hitler marries Eva Braun that night. 7 a.m. April 29th. The barrage begins against the Ministry of the Interior, Himmler's house, a stepping stone for storming the Reichstag. Soviet infantry hits the ministry with bloody hand-to-hand combat near noon. Assault squads all over the city are clearing their assigned sectors. As these short stabbing battles continued, more Soviet troops and support units moved into the blocks of the burned and blackened city, settling into cellars, camping in gardens, rummaging through rooms, pillaging in bizarre style, hunting down women, mixing acts of ferocity with sudden generosity or compassion in bewildering, brutal, fearsome, unexpected behavior. So while there are drunken squad rapes, there are also Red Army soldiers giving away their own food to the city's starving inhabitants. There are also many Soviet commanders that, for all their mission to destroy the fascist beast, are physically revolted by the idea of killing the ranks of schoolboys now facing them. And some of them even let the boys go when they're assembling POWs. You really see the best and the worst of humanity this day. You know what? Army Group Vistula has exactly 0 leadership for the best part of the 29th. It's supposed to be Manteuffel replacing Heinrizi, right? But in the morning, he refuses. He and 21st Army Commander Kurt von Tippelskirch have agreed beforehand to try not to let command out of Heinrizi's hands. Just after 4 p.m., Keitel and Jodl in person prevail upon Tippelskirch to take over until Kurt Student can arrive from the Netherlands to do it. He is captured by the British in Schleswig-Holstein, actually. So Tippelskirch at least takes command, although at this point, coordination of the army group's remaining forces is not really doable, whoever is in command. That evening, Weidling tells Hitler there are no more Panzerfausts, no way to fix any tanks, no ammo, and no hope. Hitler tells Weidling, who asks again to break out, that small groups might break out, but absolutely forbids the surrender of Berlin. Hitler has 5 questions. 1. Where are Wenck's spearheads? 2. When will they attack again? 3. Where is the 9th Army? 4. To where is it breaking through? 5. Where are Holst's spearheads? At 1 a.m., Keitel answers the questions. 1. Wenck is stopped south of Schwilovsee. So 2, they cannot attack towards Berlin. 3 and 4, 9th Army is surrounded and isn't breaking through. 5, Korps Holste is on defense from Brandenburg to Kremen. There is no hope for relief on any front. Himmler's house falls at 4:30 a.m. Noon, April 30th. The Soviet rifle divisions prepare for the final assault on the Reichstag. Now, when the battle for Berlin began, 3rd Shock Army gave out 9 red victory banners for someone to raise over the Reichstag. 150th Division gives out banners to the 3 battalions chosen to attack. At 1 p.m., 89 Soviet big guns begin pounding the Reichstag. The battalions get the order to go in. Captain Neustroyev's 1st Battalion 756 Rifles pours out of Himmler's house and breaks into the Reichstag. They clear the ground floor, but the enemy holds strong positions both below ground and on the upper floors. Neustroyev's men fight their way up, and at 2:25 in the afternoon, the banner waves from the 2nd floor, put there by Sergeants Kantaria and Yegorov. Regimental Commander Colonel Zinchenko tells them to go up and get the banner on the top of the building. At 6 p.m., a second big assault pushes through the defenders further up, slowly beating back the German machine gunners. And at 10:50 p.m., April 30th, 1945, the Soviet victory banner flies high over the Reichstag. It will, however, take time to clear the building, because the 300 or so Soviet riflemen, now among the top floors, are sitting atop a much larger German force in the basement armed with machine guns. That afternoon, Adolf and Eva Hitler commit suicide. At 3:30, Adolf Hitler sends away his staff, Goebbels, and Bormann. Eva swallows cyanide. Adolf Hitler shoots himself through the mouth. With a single shot, the 1,000-year Reich was at an end, in ignominy. A mere 12 years since it had been launched in triumph. It had been 12 years of bloodshed, war, and evil on a scale which almost defies imagination. As Soviet shells still fell around the chancellery, Hitler's body and that of Eva Braun were taken up from the bunker to the courtyard above, doused in petrol, and set on fire. Soviet 47th Army holds a line from Potsdam to Spandau. Chuikov's forces are fighting in the Tiergarten, but his right wing is closing in on Potsdamer Platz and the Reich Chancellery. His left reaches the Zoological Gardens, where 5,000 Germans are dug in with artillery behind barricades and bunkers. Weidling knows it is only a matter of time before all the Soviet forces link up and cut his forces into small pockets. How to defend? Well, he is summoned to the bunker, where Goebbels, Bormann, and OKH Chief of Staff Hans Krebs tell him about Hitler's death and swear him to secrecy. Krebs is going to tell the Soviets about Hitler's death and the new government to be set up and ask for a ceasefire so they can negotiate terms. Krebs meets with Chuikov at 3:50 a.m. the morning of May 1st. But since new Chancellor Joseph Goebbels has not authorized Krebs to agree to unconditional surrender, there is no agreement. This meeting takes all night, and it is finally at 10:15 that Moscow cuts short all arguments and says either general capitulation, the capitulation of Berlin, or the full artillery barrage begins again. At noon, Krebs returned. The Russians had agreed to let Dönitz come back to Berlin and assemble the government there, but they demanded capitulation and would not grant an armistice. Goebbels insisted that in accordance with Hitler's wishes, there be no capitulation and reiterated his already announced resolve to share the Führer's fate. At 4 p.m., the reply signed by Krebs and Bormann reaches the Soviets. Goebbels absolutely refuses to consider surrender. At 6:30 p.m., every Soviet big gun and Katyusha rocket launcher roars back to life in a massive barrage. Soviet units prepare for final assaults to crush the pockets of resistance. 3rd Shock Army has linked up with 8th Guards armies south of the Reichstag. 8th Guards have linked up with 1st Tank and 2nd Guards tank armies in the Tiergarten. 3rd and 4th Guards tank armies have cleared Wilmersdorf and Wannsee Island. Within the Reichstag, the Germans in the basement are negotiating surrender with Nostroyev's assault units. On May the 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife kill their 6 children and then commit suicide. At 1:25, the morning of the 2nd, Chuikov gets a request from 56th Panzer Corps to send emissaries for a ceasefire. Weidling has decided to surrender Berlin with 56th Panzer Corps. At 6 a.m., Weidling and senior staff officers head off to surrender Berlin, and he meets Chuikov within the hour. Goebbels is dead, so Weidling is not bound by his command. However, during that hour, another delegation arrives to meet Chuikov, that of Hans Fritzsche, Goebbels' deputy, who sends himself. He doesn't know Weidling is coming or that the Berlin garrison is on the point of surrender. Chuikov talks by phone to 1st Belarusian Front Commander Georgy Zhukov, his superior. And at 6:45 a.m., May the 2nd, Zhukov accepts Fritzsche's offer of surrender, cabling him that there are to be no demolitions of military or civilian installations or property. Fritzsche is supposed to broadcast this. On his way out, him and his company run into the arriving General Weidling. It is an icy meeting. Weidling tells Chuikov that he has issued orders for the surrender of the Berlin garrison. He also confirms the deaths of Hitler and Goebbels. The Soviets ask Weidling to write out the order for general surrender, though he protests that the lack of communications means that many German units don't even know that Hitler is dead yet. But he sits down and writes this. On the 30th of April, 1945, the Führer took his own life, and thus it is we who remain, having sworn him an oath of loyalty, who are left alone. According to the Führer's order, you, German soldiers, were to fight on in Berlin in spite of the fact that ammunition has run out and in spite of the general situation, which makes further resistance on our part senseless. My orders are to cease resistance forthwith. Weidling, General of Artillery, former commander of the Berlin Defense Zone. The Soviets removed the word former before sending it out. At 3 in the afternoon, the ceasefire takes effect, and the Soviet guns go quiet. The battle for Berlin is over. The Red Army takes 134,000 prisoners this day. Krebs, Bormann, and Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's adjutant, all commit suicide. Krebs and Burgdorf in the bunker, Bormann after leaving the bunker near the Lehrter station, which I have a feeling will in the future be Berlin Hauptbahnhof. So the Battle of Berlin is over. But the fighting is not, in fact, all over around Berlin. From near Ruhleben, a German column of like 17,000 men with some armor attacks towards the bridges over the Havel River, defended by 125th Rifle Corps, aiming to break out to the west. This fight lasts until tomorrow, when the Germans have all been chased down. But what about Walther Wenck and his 12th Army? He knows saving Berlin is impossible, but he's been pressing as much as possible towards the city to try and create an escape corridor. And though it's doubtful he can hold the position for long, by 10 a.m. May the 1st, he's only a few kilometers from the remnants of Busse's 9th Army. And miraculously, with a big push, they managed to make contact. Wenck's forces are shocked by the dire state of the 30,000 or so survivors of 9th Army and civilians in their midst. Other smaller forces are able to link up with them as well, especially thanks to the Hutten Division reaching and storming a military hospital near Potsdam. And on May 2nd, Wenck begins his retreat back towards the Elbe, leading his ragtag group hopefully into the arms of the Western Allies and not the Soviets, who are trying to catch them, though they are also pretty occupied with securing Berlin. On the 3rd, Wenck's units make contact with units from Bill Simpson's U.S. 9th Army near Tangermunde. Now, the Allies have agreed amongst themselves that either the German army will capitulate as a whole, or that small groups can surrender to them individually. But there's a hitch. This partial capitulation can only happen to the opponent they're actually engaged with, which for Wenck is the Soviets. To surrender to the Americans, Wenck technically would have to attack them and then surrender. Well, the Americans simply keep quiet with regard to the surrender proposal and do not fire on the advancing Germans either, in violation of the Allied contract. Simpson lets the wounded cross the river on a partially collapsed bridge and allows Wenck's soldiers to cross, but not the civilians. Men are even sent out on the bridge to hold back civilians trying to cross with the soldiers. Soviet rocket fire suddenly breaks out, though, shaking the bridge and killing several American soldiers. So 9th Army pulls back like 2 kilometers from the river, which allows civilians to cross. This also means, though, that much of Wenck's army must stand and fight the Soviets to give time for those civilians and his army to cross the river, which they do from today and the first couple days of next week, many sacrificing their lives for those of others. And as the final German grenades are thrown, the last artillery pieces and the last tanks are blown up, then the last German soldiers, among them General Walther Wenck himself, cross the river and enter American captivity. Wenck has actually saved many thousands of people from the madness of Berlin. That's not the only race, though. Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front is racing to trap and destroy the remnants of Hasso von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army, which broke and ran last week. But Rokossovsky is also, in fact, racing the British to Lübeck, as Churchill fears. So they're driving west and also northwest to the Baltic. They are southwest of Wismar III, where they run into the leading elements of British Second Army. The Soviets will not reach Lübeck, and as the week ends, so too do Rokossovsky's offensive operations. Speaking of Churchill, he writes to Stalin the 29th, "I have been much distressed at the misunderstanding that has grown up between us on the Crimean agreement about Poland." Well, Churchill sees that Poland is under full Soviet control. Remember, Britain and the US agreed with Stalin at Yalta that the pro-Soviet Lublin Committee could be the new Polish government once reorganized more democratically, and with the inclusion of more democratically minded Poles from both within Poland and abroad, into a government of national unity. And they had even excluded from their nominees those they saw as hard anti-Soviets trying to play ball, and choosing 3 men who even accepted the Curzon Line as the new border. Yet Stalin has invited none of those to Moscow to come before the Commission of Consultation. Furthermore, at Yalta, they agreed to establish a government based on a secret ballot and universal suffrage, with all non-Nazi parties allowed to put forth candidates. But this has not happened. What has happened is that Stalin has signed a 20-year treaty with the Lublin Committee and calls it the new government of Poland, though it is not in fact new and has not been reorganized. He's also signed a treaty with Yugoslavia, and with that in mind, Churchill continues, "There is not much comfort in looking into a future where you and the countries you dominate, plus the communist parties in many other states, are all drawn up on one side and those who rally to the English-speaking nations and their associates or dominions are on the other. It is quite obvious that their quarrel would tear the world to pieces, and that all of us leading men on either side who had anything to do with that would be shamed before history. Something else about Poland. Remember back at the end of March, 15 Polish military and political figures disappeared en route to meet Zhukov in Pruszków. Yeah, well, today the 4th, at the UN conference in San Francisco, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov stuns American Secretary of State Edward Stettinius by telling him that they had been arrested by the Red Army on charges of having earlier caused the deaths of 200 Red Army officers. When Churchill finds this out, he has more quotable words. The perfidy by which these Poles were enticed into a Russian conference and then held fast in the Russian grip is one which will emerge in great detail from the stories which have reached us. And there is no doubt that the publication in detail of this event, upon the authority of the great Western Allies, would produce a primary change in the entire structure of world forces. But it's not just this. Churchill and Truman are worried about more than the fate of Poland. Churchill writes Truman today that current Soviet control of the eastern half of Europe and all the great capital cities of Central Europe is unprecedented and pretty terrifying. And just the current Soviet demands for German reparations will be enough to pay for occupation of all of them for years, by which time they'll have sunk into Soviet-controlled police states. I'll have more to say about this next week because there is more to discuss. But there is still fighting for control in some of those places this week. I mentioned Prague and Churchill's views about it earlier on. Well, Joseph Stalin asked Ivan Konev just who is going to take Prague on April 28th. Konev says he can do it, sending force down west of Dresden. Remember, though, that Andrei Yeremenko's 4th and Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian fronts are currently fighting in central Czechoslovakia, not all that far east and southeast of Prague. Yeremenko's forces reached the suburbs of Moravska Ostrava the 29th and assault the town itself the 30th, with minimal artillery since they want to preserve the mines and factories of this industrial hub. They take it by the evening. Yeremenko then sends 3 of his armies towards Olomouc, and Malinovsky sends his right wing that way as well to link up with Yeremenko. Stalin issues orders May 1st then for Zhukov's front to take over Konev's front's position south of Berlin to the Lublin line by today, the 4th, while Konev is to wheel his forces around to face south. Malinovsky is to send the rest of his forces towards the Vltava River and Prague, taking it no later than the 12th to 14th. We'll see how it goes next week. Actually, an uprising sort of spontaneously begins today in Prague, which I will also talk about next week. Also, today in Austria, Innsbruck and Salzburg surrender to the Americans. But you know what? The Italian campaign and the Battle of Berlin are not the only big things ending this week. The Burma Campaign also comes to its end. April 28th, 17th Division faces tough resistance north of Pegu. They reach it just as night falls, and the Japanese have really fortified it, just 75 kilometers from Rangoon. It straddles the Pegu River, and the road and rail links to Rangoon are on bridges. The Japanese have blown both railway bridges. An assault by 17th Division the 29th is easily defeated. They get a foothold across the river the 30th, but the Japanese still have the one intact road bridge, and even attempt to cut the road behind 17th Division up to Tongu, though that fails. On the 30th and May 1st, 17th Division finally advances through the ruins of Pegu and are ready to advance on Rangoon the 2nd. However, that day, the torrential monsoon rains begin, 2 weeks ahead of normal schedule, and Bill Slim's Operation Extended Capital, for all the enormous amount of the country his 14th Army has liberated, does not win the race to liberate Rangoon. See, Operation Dracula is launched May 1st to liberate Rangoon, but the Japanese, as we saw last week, have decided not to fight there. A British pilot flying over the city that morning sees in large letters on top of the RAF POW camp, "Japs gone, exdigitate." The British do indeed pull their finger out, get a move on, and on the 3rd, Rangoon is fully liberated. More about Operation Dracula. 6 convoys leave Akyab and Ramri Island between April 27th and 30th, protected by 4 carriers, 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, 2 escort carriers, and 6 destroyers. They have a fighter screen above them and 12 bomber squadrons. On May 1st, Gurkhas and the 50th Indian Parachute Brigade drop in. On the 2nd, elements of 26th Division make landings as the weather worsens. They enter the city the 3rd, and the Japanese have indeed gone. It's likely that the very first of the liberators in Rangoon is actually from Slim's army, though, a pilot from 221st Group who lands at the airfield before Dracula arrives to find the enemy gone. As for Slim, he's been very eager to beat 15th Corps to Rangoon, and he flies ahead of 4th Corps from his 14th Army without real air cover with Corps Commander Frank Messervy on the 1st, piloted by an American, Robert Fullerton. They come under Japanese AA fire. Fullerton is wounded in the leg badly enough that it must soon be amputated. They land at Pegu. Slim feels pretty broken up about this. I had no business as Army commander to go where I did, and if I was so stupid as to go, I had no excuse for taking Messervy. Messervy, however, was phlegmatic and speculated they could conceivably have landed at Rangoon Airfield and found the Japanese gone. That would have put Slim's experience on a par with that of MacArthur in the Philippines. As Messervy dryly remarked, Bill Slim could have occupied Rangoon. Well, this is officially the end of the Burma Campaign, but there's still like 70,000 Japanese soldiers scattered around the country, and it will take time to defeat or capture them, especially with the monsoon. There is actually a new Allied campaign that begins this week, the Borneo Campaign. On April 27th to 30th comes the bombardment of Tarakan. On the 1st, Australian troops make landings, and the Battle of Tarakan begins the Borneo Campaign. This here is Operation Obo 1. Tarakan is like 4 kilometers off the Borneo coast and is itself like 24 by 18 kilometers, with swampland lining pretty much all of the coastline. We saw Tarakan before when the Japanese occupied it in January 1942. And it's a fairly important oil production center. It's only got 2 oil fields, but in 1941, they gave like 80,000 barrels a month. The Japanese took hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil total from Tarakan, but the last Japanese tanker left last July, and Allied air raids have destroyed the oil production capability, and they laid mines to prevent Japanese shipping from returning. The main purpose of landings here is to take the airstrip to use for operations against Brunei, Labuan, and Balikpapan. Though, of course, it would be good to secure the oil field so they have a local source. It is David Whitehead's 26th Brigade that is doing the landings, though it's been expanded to almost divisional size and has nearly 1,000 Dutch and American troops joining the landing. There are plans for other Allied landings in the works. Okay, here's something that happened near the end of last week. Now, the Americans have an invasion of Japan's home islands planned for November. But on April 25th, U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson went to see President Harry Truman with some news that might completely alter that timetable. Within 4 months, we shall in all probability have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one bomb of which could destroy a whole city. They then got to the business of discussing targets, and the target committee was looking for a city which was not already badly bombed out, a relatively fresh one. On the 27th, they ruled out Tokyo for that reason and concluded that Hiroshima was the largest untouched target that was not on 21st Bomber Command list, and it should be considered target number 1. The fight near Japan continues this week on Okinawa, of course. Here's the general situation as April turns to May for the 3 American divisions attacking the Shuri defense line. They've gained between 1 and 2 kilometers in most places, though 96 is still held up on the west flank. They are exhausted, though. There was a proposal to do a flanking amphibious landing just north of Minatogawa to maybe get the Japanese to pull force from the Shuri line, but that was rejected by General Buckner as a logistical nightmare. On April 30th, 1st Marine Division relieves 27th Infantry Division on the east flank. 77th Division, who've been busy securing Iejima Island nearby, relieves 96. As for the Japanese, Frustrated at the prolonged defensive battle, many Japanese commanders desired a counteroffensive to halt the American advance. Colonel Yahara, 32nd Army Operations Officer, warned of the folly of such an attack, but Major General Cho, Chief of Staff, prevailed. And so, on May 3rd, the Japanese counterattack. This is by 24th Division in the center and the east, but is supported by landings on both coasts in the American rear. This is a huge attack by some 75,000 men. Kamikazes begin attacking American shipping at dusk the 3rd, doing serious damage. Today the 4th, the Japanese begin the day with a heavy 30-minute artillery barrage, and then 24th Division attacks U.S. 77th and 7th Divisions. Should they break through, 62nd is to follow them, but no breakthrough happens this day. As for the kamikaze attacks, I have said several times that we'll have a special to give them the coverage that they deserve this whole campaign. That will come out in a couple weeks. With these notes from various corners of the globe, this week is over. In China, the Chinese, by this week, have reached the positions to launch their counterattacks against the Japanese Western Hunan offensive. And this they do, with 44th Division heading for Xining and Wugang. In the Philippines on the 3rd on Negros, the last Japanese positions are taken on Dolan Hill. And this is the core of their defense here. This does not finish the battle here, but the Japanese are scattered in various uncoordinated positions. On the 4th in Zagreb, Ante Pavelic, dictator of the Croatian puppet regime, declares, according to Martin Gilbert, "If we must die, let us fall as true heroes, not as cowards crying for mercy." He then leaves for the relative safety of the Austrian border. On May 1st, the German garrison on Rhodes surrenders. On the 28th in Austria is something called Operation Cowboy, but that I will get to another day, but I will. For this week of the war is over. And what a week. A massive, sprawling week of World War. The Italian campaign, over. The Burma Campaign, over. The Battle of Berlin, over. Hitler dead. Goebbels dead. Bormann dead. Mussolini dead. Most of what's left of European land with German troops on it falling to either the Soviets or the Western Allies. A new Australian campaign off Borneo, fighting continuing in the Philippines, China, and Okinawa. Wow. But Adolf Hitler dead. And despite any claims movies and books will make about it over the years, he really is dead this week in 1945. All his dreams turned to dust. His nation in ruins, his people pariah. The world has really seen the depths of evil as the advancing allies, both in the East and West, have entered camp after camp after camp the past few months. Of course, in 1933, Hitler didn't announce the building of murder factories for killing millions of people. That would not have worked. It's step by step. Step by step. And after each step, that step is slowly normalized. And then you can take the next step and normalize that until you have reached the depths of depravity. And what Hitler did, what his armies did, and his people did, the war, the Holocaust, everything, is vital to be remembered as both a commemoration for the victims and as a warning to future generations of the depth to which humanity can sink and the atrocities man can commit against his fellow man if the darkness and the hatred in some human souls is left unchecked and allowed to grow and fester.